Well, we'll get to this in time, I promise. But I hope you'll find my true story as interesting as this fictional one. My father's story certainly is as fascinating as any novel by Charles Dickens. Like many of that great writer's heroes, John Marshall Beffel was an orphan. His parents tragically drowned in Lake Michigan in 1872 when he was only 5, and he was raised in an institution outside of Racine, Wisconsin. When he was barely 13, he was pushed out into the real world to make his own way. Now, he worked a series of menial jobs, but he felt drawn to medicine. And so in 1890, he arrived at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And it's as well for me that he did, because it's there that he met and fell in love with Olive Baker of Viroqua. In 1898, after they both graduated with their respective degrees, his a master's in science, hers a bachelor's in literature, they married and moved to Milwaukee. My mother, by the way, was in the same class as Zona Gale, who went on to considerable fame and fortune as a novelist. My mother's own literary pinnacle was more modest. She wrote a book titled Stories the Trees Tell, but it's long since been lost to the dusty bookshelves of history. My father became a doctor, and in 1901, my brother was born. He was also named John Marshall, but my parents always called him Little Johnny. 4 years later, on April 8th, 1905, I came into the world and was christened Eulalie Charmaine. It's quite the name. Thank you. I don't know where the Charmaine part came from, but my first name was in honor of my mother's mother, Eulalie. It's a Greek word meaning speaking sweetly. I was later nicknamed Yuki, which doesn't sound sweet at all, does it? My childhood was what is often referred to as idyllic. Our large brown stucco house on the corner of Clybourne and 32nd Street was well shaded by trees, and I loved lying on the grassy verge making up stories about the rabbits as the streetcars rumbled by. At the age of 8, I started to write poems, which my father would proudly read aloud to his patients. I seriously doubt that helped in their recovery. But life was good for us in Milwaukee. My father's practice was thriving, and he became a respected surgeon. And my mother, meanwhile, was deeply involved in many philanthropic causes, especially on behalf of children less fortunate than her own. She also supported the suffrage movement and was an ardent believer in a woman's right to vote. Strangely, it would take catastrophe to help bring that dream to reality. I'm speaking, of course, of World War I. Now, back then, we called it simply the World War, because we had no idea that a second one would be inflicted on humanity. And we certainly had no idea that my brother and I would both serve in that. But much was to happen before then, including my father's own service in the horrors of trench warfare. In 1917, he joined the Army Medical Corps and set sail for the battlefields of Europe. Now, he firmly believed he was engaged in a fight against evil, and his love of liberty shone through in every letter he sent back home. As the war dragged on, it was heartbreaking to see his meticulous handwriting degenerate into a spidery scrawl that showed the enormous stress he was under. But sometimes he'd send a little personal note just for me. At the bottom of the page, he'd draw stick figures representing himself embracing me. So in return, I sent him my first typed letter, full of misspellings and bad grammar. My mother jokingly added a footnote at the bottom saying she had censored my words so that we broke no military protocols. Though what importance my stories about my pet cat could possibly have for the Kaiser of Germany, I have no idea. When the war was over and Father returned home mercifully unharmed, little Johnny went off to the University of Madison to study medicine, of course, and 3 years later I followed him there to study literature, naturally. I was extremely fortunate to take creative writing classes from the great author Sinclair Lewis. University life kept me very busy. I was vice president for the National Student Council of the YWCA. I played hockey and baseball. I ran track for the varsity team, and my junior year, I was on the class rifle team. Still, After I graduated with my bachelor's in 1927, I was uncertain where my future lay. I got my master's from a small college in Connecticut, and I worked for a while for a magazine in New York, but the city didn't suit me. So in 1931, I returned to Wisconsin and joined the faculty at Madison East High School. Little did I know that would be where I would spend almost 40 years of my life. But it was while teaching English that my childhood love of poetry resurfaced. And in 1937, I had a poem included in an anthology titled Poetry Out of Wisconsin, which was edited by the great Wisconsin author August Derleth. He selected my poem called Outcast, a title which seemed to sum up my feelings about my life at the time. It's very short. I hope you won't mind if I quote it in full. I did not know there was a loneliness comparable to this. One mind wandering among many minds, unable to find rest. Even the ship lost in the dark of the sea knows of a shore, and the gulls go home. After I wrote my first book, The Hero of Antietam, Mr. Derleth very kindly mentioned it in his regular column, calling it one of the best debut novels of 1943. And a review in the Chicago Daily Tribune said I had created a lovable hero in a fine Civil War romance. We writers do love our recognition, you know. Now, this book may have been set in the Civil War, but there was a new war raging now. Since 1939, Europe had been engulfed in the madness of the Nazi regime, and an unwilling America had been drawn into that conflict when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese in 1941. A number of my fellow teachers had already volunteered for military service, so on a Tuesday, October 6th, 1942, I signed my own enlistment papers for Uncle Sam. Johnny was already overseas in the Army Medical Corps, like father, like son. So after I finished my stateside training, I went overseas in January 1944. And all I took with me were my parents' best wishes and a letter from President Franklin D. Roosevelt assuring me our cause was just. I made the rank of lieutenant and worked as an operations officer for the Women's Army Corps headquarters in Algeria. After that company was disbanded, I followed Johnny once more and served at a communications base in southern France. Now, life for women in a war zone is very different than it is for men. On the one hand, we're expected to behave like one of the boys. We could smoke and cuss. We had none of the comforts of home. We'd wash by filling our helmets with cold water, and our latrines were usually little more than a canvas sheet around a hole in the ground. And we often had to scoop snails out of our shoes before putting them on in the morning. On the other hand, we were often treated like second-class citizens, and we would be subjected to crude comments from the men. We even had our mail censored more rigorously, as if women can't be trusted to keep a secret. Even after I was promoted to captain and had command of 150 soldiers, I would still feel the sting of discrimination. And yet we were often gifted little surprises, like the time my commanding officer gave me a beautiful bouquet of flowers from my volunteer work at a French orphanage. When the war was over and I returned home, I went back to teaching at East High. I was honorably discharged on January 16, 1946, with 2 citations for meritorious service. At East High, I had a reputation for being strict, though as far as I know, I'm the only teacher who brought candy into the classroom for her students, so. For a number of years after the war, I was a popular speaker at women's groups and civic functions. I would speak of the suffering of the French people at the hands of the Nazis, and I would remind my audiences that democracy is fragile. We are fortunate beyond words to live in a country that is free of fascism. In 1948, I had a short novel published in Women's Day magazine, but my writing career never really went back to its pre-war promise. I did have a collection of poetry published in a limited edition of 100 copies. It was called Bitter Weather, and it was beautifully hand-printed by a woman named Hester Schoninger. Hester and I met in the 1950s, around the time her brother was brutally murdered in Monterey, California. She and I remained very close friends for the rest of our lives. In 1969, I finally retired from teaching, though I returned briefly in 1972 to write a musical program for the school's 50th anniversary. When my brother died in 1974, I was the last remaining member of my family. I never married, I had no children, and I lived all alone in my little house on the shores of Lake Mendota. But I'm with my family now, my grandparents, my parents, my brother and me. And I'll always have this. We writers do crave immortality, you know.